Sir, I don't care if you own the damn plane, you're getting off this flight right now. Those were the last words Veronica Hayes would ever speak as a flight attendant, though she didn't know it yet. She thought she was dealing with just another passenger who didn't belong in first class, another problem she could solve with her usual mixture of authority and disdain. She was wrong about everything, but especially about who she was talking to. What happened next would become the most expensive 11 words in aviation history, triggering a cascade of events that would ground an entire airline, send executives to federal prison, and prove that sometimes the quiet passenger in seat 2A holds more power than everyone else on the plane combined. This isn't just a story about discrimination, though that's where it starts. This isn't just about corporate arrogance, though there's plenty of that. This is about the moment when institutional bias met unstoppable force, when years of unchecked prejudice collided with someone who had both the means and the moral conviction to fight back in ways no one saw coming. They thought his silence was compliance. They mistook his calm demeanor for weakness. They assumed his willingness to initially cooperate meant he was just another passenger they could push around without consequences. But Elijah Whitmore wasn't just another passenger. And when Skybridge Airways Flight 847 forced him off the plane that Tuesday morning, they didn't just lose a customer. They lost everything. The recycled air inside the cabin of Skybridge Airways Flight 847 to London carried the familiar smell of coffee cleaning solution and the faint anxiety that always seems to hover in airports. Elijah Whitmore adjusted his position in seat 2A and glanced at his watch, calculating the time difference between Chicago and London, then between London and his daughter's school in Connecticut. He was going to miss Zoe's piano recital again, and the guilt sat heavy in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow. 3 months of merger negotiations with a European aerospace consortium had stretched what should have been a 2-week trip into an endless cycle of flights, hotel rooms, and conference tables. At 41, Elijah had learned that success in corporate law often meant sacrificing the moments that actually mattered, but that knowledge never made it easier. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his ex-wife, Sarah. Flight delayed, but should make it for the after-party. Tell Zoe I'm proud of her. It was a small lie about the timing, but he'd learned that 8-year-olds needed hope more than they needed absolute honesty about their father's complicated schedule. Elijah had the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of being underestimated and then proving people spectacularly wrong. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and dark skin that seemed to absorb the harsh cabin lighting, he cut an imposing figure even when he wasn't trying to. His wire-rimmed glasses softened his gaze somewhat, but there was an alertness behind his eyes that missed nothing, a quality that had served him well in both courtrooms and boardrooms. The charcoal suit he wore was expensive, but not flashy, tailored perfectly, but without obvious designer labels. Everything about his appearance suggested success without screaming for attention, which was exactly how he preferred it. He'd learned early in his career that being a successful black lawyer meant walking a careful line between commanding respect and avoiding the kind of attention that made insecure white colleagues uncomfortable. As general counsel for Aerovault International, one of the world's largest aircraft leasing companies, Elijah had spent the better part of 15 years mastering the intricate dance of international aviation finance. He knew every clause in every contract, every regulatory requirement in every jurisdiction, and every pressure point that could bring a major airline to its knees if properly applied. But more than that, he understood power and how it moved through corporate structures like electricity, through carefully designed circuits. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent most of his professional life ensuring that airlines could keep their planes in the air, while personally he spent so much time in those same planes that airports had started to feel more like home than his actual house. Today was supposed to be different, though. Today was supposed to be the last flight before a 2-week vacation with Zoe, their first real time together since the divorce was finalized. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he'd felt truly relaxed, the last time he'd gone more than 6 hours without checking his email or thinking about some contract dispute or regulatory filing. The memory that came back wasn't recent enough to be comforting. Excuse me, sir. The voice cut through Elijah's attempt at meditation with the sharp edge of forced politeness that immediately put him on alert. He opened his eyes and looked up to see a woman standing in the aisle beside his seat. Her blonde hair styled into the kind of rigid perfection that looked like it could survive a Category 5 hurricane. The name tag on her navy blue uniform read, Veronica Hayes Senior Purser, and everything about her posture suggested someone who was used to being obeyed without question. She was probably in her late 40s with the kind of practiced smile that airlines trained their staff to deploy like a weapon when dealing with difficult passengers. Yes, Elijah's voice carried the neutral tone he'd perfected for situations where he sensed trouble coming, but wasn't quite sure what form it would take. 15 years of practicing law had taught him that the person who stayed calm longest usually won whatever contest was about to begin. "I need to see your boarding pass, please," Veronica said, though the way she said it made it clear she wasn't really asking. There was something in her eyes, a kind of suspicious intensity that Elijah recognized immediately. He'd seen that look before in restaurants where the hostess suddenly couldn't find his reservation in stores, where security seemed to materialize whenever he browsed the expensive merchandise in corporate meetings, where his presence was questioned despite being the lead attorney on the deal. "I already showed it at the gate," Elijah said, keeping his voice level and pleasant. "And again, when I boarded. But, sure, happy to show it again." He unlocked his phone and pulled up his digital boarding pass, holding it out where she could see the QR code and his seat assignment clearly displayed. Veronica leaned in, squinting at the screen as if she were examining a suspicious document for signs of forgery. Behind her, Elijah could see other passengers starting to pay attention, their conversations trailing off as they sensed the tension building in the first-class cabin. Seat 2. She read aloud, her tone carrying a note of disbelief that she didn't even try to hide. "That's a very expensive seat, sir. Are you sure you didn't accidentally upgrade yourself through the app? Sometimes there are glitches in the system that allow unauthorized access to premium seating." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished match. Elijah felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with moments like these, the combination of anger and resignation that he'd been carrying since childhood. He glanced around the cabin and noticed that every other first-class passenger was white, which probably wasn't a coincidence given the demographics of business travelers on transatlantic routes, but it certainly made him more visible in ways he'd rather not be. The ticket was purchased legitimately through the corporate travel department, Elijah said, his patience beginning to show signs of strain around the edges. "American Express Platinum Corporate Card if you need payment verification. I'm traveling on business for Aerovault International. Is there some specific problem with my seat assignment?" At the mention of Aerovault, something flickered in Veronica's eyes, though Elijah couldn't tell if it was recognition or dismissal. She straightened up and looked past him toward the back of the first-class cabin where an elderly white man in a tweed jacket was standing in the aisle looking impatient. "Mr. Wellington," Veronica called out, her voice suddenly warm and deferential in a way it definitely hadn't been when speaking to Elijah. "I'm terribly sorry for the delay. We're just sorting out a seating discrepancy that should be resolved momentarily." And there it was. Elijah saw the whole picture in that instant, the way Veronica's attention shifted between him and Wellington, like she was calculating the most efficient way to rearrange the cabin to everyone's satisfaction. Everyone's satisfaction except his, of course. "There's no discrepancy," Elijah said, his voice taking on a harder edge that made several passengers turn in their seats to look directly at the confrontation. "I'm in my assigned seat with a valid ticket that I paid for. If Mr. Wellington has a seating issue, I suggest you work that out with him separately." Veronica's practiced smile disappeared entirely, replaced by the kind of cold authority that airline employees wielded like a club when passengers didn't cooperate with their arbitrary decisions. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the seat so we can verify your credentials at the podium. You're blocking the boarding process and creating a disturbance." The boarding process had actually finished 20 minutes ago, and the only disturbance was the one Veronica had created by questioning his right to be there. But Elijah knew better than to point out logical inconsistencies when someone was looking for reasons to escalate a situation. He'd been in enough of these confrontations to know that logic rarely mattered once bias kicked in. "I can verify my credentials right here," Elijah said, tapping his phone screen. "You can also check your passenger manifest to confirm I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. There's no need for me to move anywhere." Sir Veronica's voice rose sharply loud enough that conversations throughout the first-class cabin stopped entirely. "If you do not comply with crew instructions immediately, that constitutes a federal offense under aviation safety regulations. I am giving you a direct order to step out of that seat." The cabin went completely silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning system. Elijah could feel the weight of every gaze in first class, some sympathetic but most carrying that uncomfortable mixture of curiosity and judgment that always accompanied scenes like this. He knew exactly what was happening because he'd lived through variations of it his entire adult life. If he raised his voice now, he'd be labeled aggressive and threatening. If he refused to move, he'd be called non-compliant and disruptive. If he tried to explain his position rationally, they'd say he was argumentative and difficult. There was no winning move in this particular game because the rules had been written to ensure he would always lose. But Elijah Whitmore hadn't become one of the most successful aviation lawyers in the world by accepting lose-lose scenarios. He stood up slowly, his full height making him tower over Veronica in a way that clearly made her uncomfortable. "Fine," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled calm that suggested much more power than shouting ever could. "Let's go verify my credentials. But I want it on record that I am being removed from my assigned seat despite having valid documentation, and I want to know exactly what federal regulation you're claiming I violated by sitting in the seat I purchased." The walk down the aisle toward the jet bridge felt like the longest journey of Elijah's life, though it couldn't have been more than 30 feet. He could feel the eyes of every passenger tracking his movement, some with sympathy, but too many with the kind of smug satisfaction that came from watching someone they assumed didn't belong get put in their place. As they reached the aircraft door, Elijah caught a glimpse of Mr. Wellington settling into seat 2A with the satisfied air of someone who'd just won a contest he didn't even know he was playing. The injustice of it burned in Elijah's chest like acid, but he kept his expression neutral and his movements controlled. He had no idea that in less than 10 minutes he would make a phone call that would change everything, not just for this flight, but for the entire airline industry. He had no idea that Wellington's moment of triumph would become the most expensive seat swap in corporate history. But he was about to find out. The jet bridge felt like a tunnel between two different worlds, the recycled air of the aircraft giving way to the humid Chicago atmosphere that leaked through the accordion walls. Elijah stood quietly against the sidewall, watching Gary Chen. The gate agent frantically typed on his computer terminal, while Veronica hovered nearby with her arms crossed and her jaw set in a line that suggested she was prepared to fight this battle until someone higher up told her to stop. "The system confirms it," Gary said, his voice carrying a note of confusion as he stared at his screen. "Elijah Whitmore, seat 2. A paid in full business class upgrade purchased through corporate account. The ticket is completely legitimate." Veronica's face flushed red in a way that suggested embarrassment was quickly transforming into something more dangerous. "That's impossible. Look at him, Gary. Does he look like someone who regularly flies first class on international routes? There has to be some mistake, some glitch in the booking system that allowed him to access seating he shouldn't have." Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach, the familiar sensation of being reduced to nothing more than his appearance and the assumptions people made based on the color of his skin. He'd felt it in law school when professors questioned whether he belonged in advanced constitutional law seminars. He'd felt it in corporate boardrooms when clients asked to speak to the real lawyer handling their case. And now he was feeling it 30,000 feet above sea level while standing in a jet bridge that smelled like diesel fuel and broken dreams. "I'm making a phone call," Elijah said quietly, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness to make sure no one could interpret the motion as threatening. "You can't make calls on the jet bridge if it interferes with aircraft operations," Veronica snapped, though Gary looked uncomfortable with her increasingly aggressive stance. "I'm not interfering with anything except your attempt to deny me service. I've already paid for." "Elijah," replied, his thumb already scrolling through his contacts to find the number he'd hoped never to use in a situation like this. The number, connected on the second ring, answered by a gruff British accent that belonged to William Blackwood, CEO of Aerovault International and one of the most powerful men in global aviation. "Whitmore," the voice said, dispensing with pleasantries as always. "Aren't you supposed to be somewhere over the Atlantic by now?" "I'm supposed to be." "Elijah," said, his eyes never leaving Veronica's face as he spoke. "But apparently I don't look like the kind of passenger who belongs in first class, so the crew of Skybridge Airways Flight 847 has decided to deny me boarding despite my valid ticket." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds, and Elijah could practically hear the gears turning in William's mind as he processed the implications of what he'd just been told. William Blackwood hadn't built a multi-billion-dollar empire by being slow to understand when someone had made a catastrophic mistake. "Did you say Skybridge Airways?" William's voice had dropped to the dangerous quiet tone that his executives had learned meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Flight 847, Gate 42, currently scheduled for departure in about 15 minutes, Elijah confirmed. "The purser, Veronica Hayes, seems to believe that I've somehow hacked their reservation system to upgrade myself illegally. The gate agent has confirmed my ticket multiple times, but Ms. Hayes is insisting that I be removed for the comfort and safety of other passengers." William's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Elijah, you do realize that Aerovault owns or leases 67% of Skybridge's long-haul fleet, don't you? Including the Boeing 777-300ER that you're supposed to be sitting on right now?" "I do realize that," William Elijah said, watching Veronica's expression change as she began to pick up pieces of the conversation. "I also recall that I personally drafted the operational compliance clauses in every one of those lease agreements, including Section 19, which allows for immediate suspension of aircraft certification in cases of operational negligence that could expose the lessor to legal liability." "Section 19," William repeated slowly, and Elijah could hear the smile creeping into his voice. "The clause that defines operational negligence to include any conduct by airline personnel that violates federal anti-discrimination laws and creates potential legal exposure for Aerovault. That's the one," Elijah confirmed. "And I'm looking at a situation where Skybridge personnel are violating Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, provisions for public accommodation, and potentially creating a hostile environment that could result in significant legal liability for any company associated with their operations." Gary Chin had gone completely pale as he listened to one side of the conversation that was clearly way above his pay grade. Veronica was still trying to maintain her authoritative stance, but something in her eyes suggested she was beginning to understand that she'd picked a fight with someone who had resources she couldn't imagine. "What do you need?" Elijah William asked, his voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone who'd made the decision to go to war. "I need the operational certification for the Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines on aircraft tail, number November 778. Skybridge revoked immediately pending a full compliance review," Elijah said, reading the aircraft's registration number from the departure board above Gary's head. "Those engines are leased from our subsidiary, and I don't feel comfortable having Aerovault's assets operated by a carrier that can't train its staff to follow federal law." "Consider it done," William said. "I'll have operations contact the tower immediately. That bird isn't going anywhere until we're satisfied that Skybridge can operate our equipment responsibly." Elijah hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Gary, whose hands were literally shaking as he stared at his computer screen, and then at Veronica, whose face had gone from red to white in the span of 30 seconds. "Something wrong?" Elijah asked pleasantly. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong came from the terminal's departure board, where Flight 847's status changed from on time to delayed in bold red letters. Gary Chen stared at the screen like he was watching his career dissolve in real time, which wasn't far from the truth. "I don't understand," Gary muttered, frantically refreshing his computer system. Operations just sent a message saying the aircraft has been removed from service due to engine certification issues. They're saying the engines are no longer authorized for operation by Skybridge Airways, effective immediately. Through the jet bridge windows, Elijah could see the ground crew moving around the aircraft with the kind of urgent confusion that suggested no one had expected this particular crisis. The engines, which had been slowly spooling up for departure just minutes earlier, were now completely silent. Gary's phone rang with the sharp electronic trill that gate agents learned to fear because it usually meant someone much higher up the corporate chain was about to make their day significantly worse. He answered with a voice that cracked slightly around the edges. "Gate 42, this is Gary." The voice on the other end was loud enough that Elijah could hear every word, and what he heard made him smile for the first time since this entire ordeal began. It was Captain James Crawford, and he sounded like a man who'd just discovered that his aircraft had been transformed into the world's most expensive paperweight. "Gary, what the hell is going on down there? Tower just informed me that our engine certification has been revoked by the leasing company. They're saying we cannot taxi, we cannot take off. We cannot even move the aircraft without violating federal aviation regulations. Who authorized this?" "What did you people do?" Gary looked at Elijah with the expression of someone who'd just realized he was standing in the middle of a minefield. "Captain, there's a passenger down here who was denied boarding, and apparently he's connected to the leasing company somehow." Connected how Crawford's voice carried the kind of barely controlled fury that came from having 300 passengers trapped on an aircraft that wasn't going anywhere, while the clock ticked away precious flight time and fuel costs. "I think you should come down here and talk to him yourself," Captain Gary said wisely, deciding that this conversation was happening at a level far above anything his training had prepared him for. Veronica, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. He can't just shut down an entire flight because he's upset about being asked to show his boarding pass. We have policies and procedures. We have the right to ensure passenger safety and comfort." Ms. Hayes Elijah said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "You don't have the right to violate federal civil rights law, and you certainly don't have the right to do it using aircraft that my company owns. What you've done here isn't just discrimination. It's discrimination using assets that belong to AeroVault International, which makes it our problem and gives us every right to protect our interests." The jet bridge door burst open with enough force to rattle the accordion walls, and Captain James Crawford stormed out looking like a man who'd just been told his house was on fire while he was trapped inside it. He was probably in his late 50s with the kind of silver-haired authority that airlines liked to put in their marketing materials, but right now he looked more like someone who was about to have a nervous breakdown. "You," Crawford said, pointing directly at Elijah with the kind of accusatory gesture that would have been intimidating if Elijah hadn't spent the last 15 years being pointed at by angry executives. "Are you the passenger who called in some kind of engine complaint? I'm the passenger who was discriminated against by your purser, and then made a phone call to my employer to report that Skybridge Airways was using our aircraft to violate federal law." Elijah replied calmly. "The engine certification revocation is a reasonable business response to protect AeroVault's assets from being involved in illegal discriminatory practices." Crawford turned to Veronica with the kind of look that suggested someone was about to be thrown under several buses simultaneously. "What exactly did you do?" "I followed standard procedures for suspicious passengers," Veronica said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. He was in first class, and something about his demeanor seemed off. I was trying to verify his credentials when he became hostile and non-compliant. I never raised my voice, I never refused a reasonable request, and I provided my boarding pass every time you asked for it, Elijah said. I have the entire interaction recorded on my phone if you'd like to review exactly what happened. The mention of a recording hit the group like a physical blow. Crawford closed his eyes and appeared to be counting to 10 in his head, while Gary looked like he might actually faint, while chaos unfolded at Gate 42, 2,000 miles away in Atlanta. The corporate headquarters of Skybridge Airways was experiencing its own version of panic. Richard Thornton, the CEO, had been pulled out of a budget meeting by his assistant with the kind of urgent whisper that every executive learned to fear. Sir, we have a situation. The situation, as it turned out, was shaping up to be the kind of corporate crisis that business schools would eventually write case studies about. Within 15 minutes of Elijah's phone call to William Blackwood, every senior executive at Skybridge had been pulled into an emergency conference call that started with someone asking, "Who the hell is Elijah Whitmore?" and rapidly devolved into the kind of blame-shifting and finger-pointing that happened when everyone realized they were probably about to lose their jobs. "Let me understand this correctly," Richard said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone trying very hard not to scream. One of our pursers racially profiled a passenger, removed him from the aircraft despite a valid first-class ticket, and that passenger turned out to be the general counsel for the company that owns most of our fleet. "That's essentially correct, sir," said Janet Morrison, the vice president of operations, who'd been tasked with explaining how a routine passenger service issue had turned into a company-threatening crisis. Aerovault International has revoked the engine certification for Flight 847 and is threatening to audit all of our other lease agreements for compliance violations. The conference room where Richard sat overlooking the Atlanta skyline had been designed to project confidence and success with its floor-to-ceiling windows and polished mahogany table that could seat 20 executives. Right now, it felt more like a bunker where a group of generals were planning their surrender. "How much of our fleet is affected?" Richard asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to hear the answer. "Aerovault owns or finances 42 of our aircraft," said Michael Chen, the chief financial officer, reading from a tablet that seemed to be delivering nothing but bad news. "That's about 67% of our long-haul capacity. If they decide to review all those lease agreements and find compliance issues, they could ground our entire international operation." Richard rubbed his temples where a headache was building that felt like it might actually kill him. Skybridge Airways had been struggling financially even before this crisis, competing against larger carriers with better route networks and more efficient operations. The company had been built on the razor-thin margins that characterize the airline industry, which meant they had almost no cushion for the kind of catastrophic event that was unfolding in Chicago. "What do we know about this Whitmore character?" Richard asked. "What's he going to want to make this go away?" "We've been doing research on him for the last 20 minutes, Janet said, consulting her notes. "He's been Aerovault's general counsel for 8 years, specializes in international aviation finance, and personally negotiated most of our current lease agreements. He graduated from Harvard Law, worked for 3 major law firms, and apparently has a reputation for being very thorough and very unforgiving when clients try to take advantage of his companies." "Wonderful," Richard said. "So we discriminated against a Harvard lawyer who controls our ability to fly planes. Anyone have suggestions for how we fix this before it gets worse?" The silence in the conference room stretched uncomfortably as everyone tried to think of solutions that didn't exist. Finally, Michael spoke up. "We could offer him money. Significant money. Enough to make this go away quietly. He's the general counsel for a company worth about $15 billion, Janet pointed out. I don't think we can afford the kind of money that would impress him." Richard's phone buzzed with a text message that made his stomach drop even further. Video of incident going viral on social media. Hashtag Skybridge discrimination trending. Suggest immediate response. It was from the head of public relations, which meant the story was already beyond their ability to control. "Get me a direct line to this, Whitmore," Richard said, standing up and walking to the windows where he could see planes taking off and landing at Atlanta's airport with the kind of routine efficiency that his company might never experience again. "And get our legal team on the phone with Aero Vault's executives. We need to contain this before it destroys everything we've built." But even as he gave those orders, Richard Thornton suspected it was already too late. In the airline industry, trust was everything, and once you lost it with your lessors, your regulators, and your passengers, getting it back was nearly impossible. The viral video that would ultimately seal Skybridge's fate was already spreading across the internet like wildfire, and Richard had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Jessica Park had never expected her Tuesday morning flight to London to become the most important video she'd ever posted, but that's exactly what happened when she started recording the drama unfolding in first class. The 19-year-old Northwestern journalism student had been documenting her study abroad trip to Europe, building a modest following of about 50,000 on TikTok with videos about student travel and budget adventures. What she captured instead was 12 minutes of raw footage that would fundamentally change how the airline industry handled discrimination complaints, though she didn't know that when she started filming through the gap between seats while pretending to read a magazine. The video began with Veronica Hayes standing over Elijah's seat, her voice carrying clearly across the first-class cabin as she demanded to see his boarding pass for the third time. Jessica's hands were surprisingly steady as she recorded, catching every nuance of Veronica's increasingly aggressive tone and Elijah's calm, measured responses. "Are you sure you didn't accidentally upgrade yourself through the app?" Veronica's voice came through clearly on the recording. "Sometimes there are glitches in the system that allow unauthorized access to premium seating." The implicit accusation was obvious to everyone listening, and Jessica could see other passengers exchanging uncomfortable glances as they realized what was happening. She kept recording as the situation escalated, capturing Veronica's demand that Elijah move to verify his credentials and his reasonable request to handle the verification without leaving his seat. But the money shot, the moment that would make the video explode across social media, came when Mr. Wellington finally got settled in seat 2A and made the mistake of expressing his satisfaction a little too loudly. Finally, Wellington said to the passenger across the aisle, apparently unaware that Jessica was still recording, "I don't know why airlines let just anyone into first class these days. Some people clearly don't understand that these seats are for serious business travelers, not people trying to scam their way into upgrades they can't afford." The comment landed like a bomb in the quiet cabin, and Jessica could see several passengers reacting with visible disgust. One woman actually shook her head and muttered "unbelievable" under her breath, which the microphone picked up perfectly. Jessica didn't realize she'd captured something special until she reviewed the footage during the extended delay that followed. The contrast was stark and damning. Elijah's dignified restraint versus Veronica's aggressive suspicion. Gary's nervous fumbling with computer systems versus Captain Crawford's angry demands for explanations. Wellington's casual racism versus the uncomfortable silence of passengers who knew they were witnessing something terrible. She edited the video down to 8 minutes, adding simple captions that identified the key players and explained the context for viewers who might not immediately understand the discrimination that was occurring. The title she chose was "Direct and Powerful Racist Flight Attendant Kicks Off Paying Passenger. What Happens Next Will Shock You." The video uploaded at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time, just as the extended delay was reaching its third hour, and passengers were starting to demand answers about why they were still sitting on the tarmac in Chicago instead of flying toward London. The response was immediate and volcanic. Within the first hour, the video had been viewed 200,000 times and shared across every major social media platform. The comment section became a battlefield of outrage, with viewers expressing everything from fury at Veronica's behavior to amazement at Elijah's calm professionalism under pressure. "This is why I document everything when I travel," wrote one user. "Airlines think they can treat people however they want because usually there's no proof." "The way she kept demanding his boarding pass like he stole it or something made me physically sick," commented another. "And then that old man's racist garbage at the end, I hope they all get fired." But the comment that really captured the moment came from a user who seemed to understand more about the situation than most y'all don't understand what just happened here. That quiet passenger who got kicked off, he just shut down their entire flight with one phone call. This isn't just discrimination. This is discrimination with consequences. By the time Jessica's plane finally took off 6 hours later, her video had been viewed 2.5 million times and had been picked up by news organizations around the world. The hashtags #Skybridge Discrimination and #Justice for Elijah were trending globally, and the story was being covered on every major network's evening news. But the real impact wouldn't be felt until the next morning, when federal investigators would use Jessica's video as evidence in what would become one of the largest discrimination cases in aviation history. The clear audio and video documentation of Veronica's behavior, combined with Wellington's racist commentary, provided exactly the kind of unambiguous proof that civil rights lawyers dream about. Jessica Park had started the day as a college student with a modest social media following. She ended it as the person who'd documented the moment when institutional discrimination met its match, and her video would eventually be viewed more than 50 million times as the Skybridge Airways crisis unfolded in real time across the internet. The airline industry would never be quite the same. The marble lobby of Skybridge Airways headquarters in Atlanta was designed to impress visitors with its soaring ceilings, polished stone floors, and the massive model of a Boeing 777 suspended from cables like a corporate monument to human flight. On any normal Wednesday morning, it projected exactly the kind of confidence and success that airlines wanted their investors and partners to see. This was not a normal Wednesday morning. At precisely 8 a.m., the glass doors slid open and 15 people in dark suits walked in with the kind of coordinated purpose that made the security guards immediately reach for their radios. They moved like a military unit, pulling identical rolling briefcases and wearing the sort of serious expressions that suggested they weren't there for a friendly business meeting. Leading the group was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a former FAA senior investigator who'd spent 20 years finding the kind of maintenance shortcuts and compliance failures that killed people. Beside her walked Kevin Torres, a technical systems specialist who could read aircraft maintenance logs like other people read novels, and Rachel Okafor, an HR compliance expert who'd built her reputation destroying companies that thought diversity training was optional. This was AeroVault's Reaper team, though they'd never used that name in any official capacity. They were the forensic auditors who got called in when William Blackwood suspected that a partner company had crossed the line from aggressive cost-cutting into dangerous negligence, and their arrival at any corporate headquarters usually meant someone's career was about to end badly. "We're here for the compliance audit," Dr. Mitchell announced to the receptionist who was staring at the group like she'd never seen so many people in expensive suits show up unannounced. "Please notify Mr. Thornton that AeroVault's review team has arrived and will be starting immediately." The receptionist's training had covered many difficult situations, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when a small army of auditors announced they were taking over her building. She reached for her phone with hands that shook slightly as she dialed the executive floor. "Mr. Thornton's office, this is his assistant," came the voice on the other end. "There are some people here from AeroVault," the receptionist said, lowering her voice as if that would somehow make the situation less threatening. "They say they're here for an audit and they want to start immediately." The pause that followed was long enough for the receptionist to wonder if the call had been dropped. But then she heard the assistant's voice again, now carrying a note of barely controlled panic. "How many people?" 15, the receptionist whispered. "They have briefcases, and they look very serious." While this conversation was happening, Dr. Mitchell had already deployed her team with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Kevin Torres headed for the elevators with 3 technical specialists who would focus on maintenance records and safety protocols. Rachel Okafor took 4 compliance experts toward the HR department to review personnel files and training documentation. The remaining team members spread out to secure access to financial records, operational procedures, and executive communications. They weren't just looking for evidence of the discrimination that had triggered this audit, though that would certainly be part of their investigation. They were conducting what AeroVault called a trust verification review, which was corporate speak, for we're going to examine every aspect of your operation until we're satisfied that you're not going to embarrass us or get us sued. Richard Thornton appeared in the lobby 12 minutes later, looking like a man who hadn't slept well, and had been hoping this day would never come. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, his tie was crooked, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he looked like he'd aged 5 years since yesterday. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, approaching the group with the kind of forced smile that fooled nobody. "I wasn't expecting AeroVault to conduct an audit so quickly. Surely we can work this out through normal channels without disrupting our entire operation." "Mr. Thornton," Dr. Mitchell replied without returning his smile. "Your employee violated federal civil rights law while operating aircraft that belong to our clients. That's not a normal channel situation. That's a full audit situation. And according to Section 19 of our lease agreements, we don't need your permission or your cooperation, though both would make this process considerably more efficient." Of course," Richard said, his voice carrying the strained enthusiasm of someone trying to make the best of a disaster. "We want to cooperate fully. It's just that some of our records are stored off-site, and our legal department will need time to review confidentiality requirements." "Doctor," Mitchell opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents that she handed to Richard with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone serving a warrant. "Section 19 also waives confidentiality protections for compliance reviews. Everything we need is either in this building or accessible through your computer systems, and we'll be accessing all of it today." As Richard flipped through the documents with growing horror, Dr. Mitchell continued, "We'll be reviewing 5 years of discrimination complaints, personnel actions, training records, safety protocols, maintenance procedures, and executive communications. We expect full access to all relevant personnel for interviews, and any attempt to interfere with our investigation will result in immediate termination of all lease agreements." The threat landed like a physical blow. Richard knew exactly what immediate termination of all lease agreements would mean for Skybridge Airways, and it wasn't bankruptcy. It was instantaneous corporate death. Airlines couldn't operate without planes, and planes they couldn't afford to buy outright. "I'll have my assistant get you whatever you need," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That won't be necessary," Dr. Mitchell said. "We've already started." Rachel Okafor had seen a lot of corporate discrimination in her 15 years as a compliance investigator, but the Skybridge Airways personnel files were something special. She'd been working for 4 hours in a conference room they'd commandeered on the 12th floor, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer printouts that told a story more damaging than anything she'd expected to find. "Sarah." She called out to Dr. Mitchell, who was reviewing maintenance logs at the other end of the room. "You need to see this. We've got a pattern here that's way bigger than just one incident." Dr. Mitchell looked up from a stack of engine inspection reports that were raising their own red flags and walked over to where Rachel had arranged several dozen complaint forms in chronological order across the conference table. "Veronica Hayes," Rachel said, pointing to the name that appeared on complaint after complaint. 31 formal discrimination complaints filed against her over the last 8 years. 31. And that's just the ones that made it to HR in writing. Dr. Mitchell picked up one of the files and started reading. The complaints painted a picture of someone who'd made discriminating against passengers of color into an art form, with a particular focus on questioning the legitimacy of black passengers in premium seating. March 2019. Dr. Mitchell read aloud. Passenger, Marcus Williams seat, 1B to Paris, asked to show boarding pass 4 times. Questioned about upgrade legitimacy made to step off aircraft for verification. Complaint resolved with flight voucher and apology. No disciplinary action taken against Hayes. July 2019. Rachel continued reading from another file. Passenger Janet Chen, seat 2A to Tokyo, accused of using stolen credit card to purchase ticket, detained by airport security until card verified as legitimate. Hayes claimed passenger seemed suspicious. No disciplinary action. September 2019, December 2019, February 2020. Dr. Mitchell said, flipping through complaint after complaint. This woman has been terrorizing passengers for years, and management knew about every single incident. But the most damaging discovery wasn't just the complaints themselves, it was how they'd been handled. Rachel had found internal email chains between HR, executives, operations managers, and senior leadership that revealed a deliberate pattern of covering up Hayes' behavior to protect the company from liability. Look at this email from 2020, Rachel said, handing Dr. Mitchell a printout that made her eyebrows rise as she read. It's from the VP of Operations to the HR director. Quote, Hayes' situation is getting out of hand, but she's connected through family to senior management. Find a way to make the complaints disappear without creating a paper trail that exposes us to federal investigation. The email was signed by Thomas Morrison, who, according to the organizational chart, was still the VP of Operations and one of Richard Thornton's closest advisors. More importantly, it provided documentary evidence that Skybridge's executive team had known about Hayes' discriminatory behavior and had actively worked to cover it up rather than address it. This isn't just individual racism, Dr. Mitchell said, sitting down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. This is institutional racism with corporate protection. They turned discrimination into company policy. Rachel nodded grimly. And it gets worse. Hayes is married to David Morrison, who is Thomas Morrison's brother. She's been untouchable because she's family to one of the most powerful executives in the company. Every complaint against her went to HR, reported it to Thomas Morrison, and Thomas Morrison made sure nothing happened to his sister-in-law. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a case of one rogue employee who'd slipped through the cracks. It was evidence of a company that had decided discrimination was acceptable as long as it kept certain passengers happy and didn't generate too much negative publicity. How many passengers do you think she's done this to over the years? Dr. Mitchell asked. Based on the complaints we've found and the incidents that probably never got reported, Rachel said, doing quick calculations in her head. Easily hundreds, maybe more than 1,000 over her 15-year career. While Rachel was uncovering the human resources disaster, Kevin Torres was making discoveries in the maintenance department that were equally troubling. The technical audit was supposed to focus on operational compliance, but what he'd found suggested that Skybridge's problems went far beyond discrimination into areas that could literally kill people. Dr. Mitchell. Kevin called from across the room, his voice carrying the kind of tension that made everyone stop what they were doing. I need you to look at these maintenance logs right now. The documents Kevin had spread across his table were aircraft inspection reports for Skybridge's Boeing 777 fleet, the same type of aircraft that Elijah had been removed from the day before. What they revealed was a pattern of falsified inspections, deferred maintenance, and cost-cutting that violated multiple federal aviation regulations. They're logging flight hours incorrectly to delay mandatory engine overhauls, Kevin explained, pointing to discrepancies between the official logs and the data downloaded from aircraft computers. Look at tail number N778SB, the plane from yesterday's incident. According to their maintenance logs, it's had 4,200 flight hours since the last major engine inspection, but the aircraft's own computer shows 600 hours. Dr. Mitchell studied the numbers, her face growing paler as she understood what Kevin was showing her. That's almost 2,000 hours of illegal operation. How many planes show similar discrepancies? 14 out of the 18 aircraft I've reviewed so far, Kevin said. They're also extending landing gear inspection cycles beyond manufacturer recommendations, using uncertified replacement parts and having maintenance work done by contractors who don't meet AeroVault's certification requirements. The maintenance fraud was potentially even more serious than the discrimination because it meant passengers had been flying on aircraft that weren't safe. If the FAA discovered what Kevin had found, they wouldn't just ground Skybridge's fleet. They'd launch a criminal investigation that could send executives to federal prison. This is corporate manslaughter waiting to happen, Dr. Mitchell said quietly. They're cutting costs by ignoring safety regulations, and eventually one of these planes is going to fall out of the sky. But even that wasn't the end of their discoveries. As the day progressed and the audit team dug deeper into Skybridge's operations, they uncovered evidence of fuel fraud, route certification violations, pilot training deficiencies, and financial irregularities that painted a picture of a company that had turned corner cutting into a business model. By late afternoon, Dr. Mitchell knew they'd found enough evidence to destroy Skybridge Airways permanently. The only question now was whether they'd also found enough evidence to send the executives to prison. Kevin Torres had been examining aircraft maintenance records for 2 decades, first as an FAA inspector and then as a private consultant specializing in aviation safety compliance, but he'd never seen anything quite like what he was finding in Skybridge's maintenance logs. It wasn't just that they were cutting corners. They were cutting corners while creating elaborate documentation to hide what they were doing from regulators. "This is sophisticated fraud," he said to Dr. Mitchell as she reviewed his findings. Someone spent a lot of time and effort creating a parallel set of books that would pass casual inspection while hiding the real maintenance history of these aircraft. The conference room had been transformed into what looked like a war room with maintenance logs, computer printouts, and technical diagrams covering every available surface. Kevin had been working with 3 specialists from AeroVault's technical compliance team, and together they'd uncovered a pattern of safety violations that was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. "Walk me through the worst of it," Dr. Mitchell said, settling into a chair with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Aircraft N778SB, the plane from yesterday's discrimination incident. Kevin began pulling out a thick folder. According to their official maintenance log submitted to the FAA, this aircraft has 4,200 flight hours since its last major engine overhaul, which is well within the 5,000-hour limit required by Rolls-Royce and federal regulations. He opened the folder to reveal computer printouts that told a very different story. But the aircraft's own flight management computer, which can't be easily altered, shows 600 actual flight hours. They've been operating this plane 1,900 hours beyond the legal limit for engine safety. Dr. Mitchell studied the numbers with growing alarm. How is that possible? Don't the engines have their own tracking systems? They do, but Skybridge found a way around that too, Kevin said, pulling out another set of documents. They've been sending planes to a maintenance facility in Mexico that specializes in resetting engine hour counters without doing actual overhaul work. It costs about $50,000 per plane compared to the $2 million for a legitimate engine overhaul. The implications were staggering. Engine overhauls weren't just routine maintenance. They were critical safety procedures that involved completely disassembling the engines, inspecting every component for wear and damage, and replacing parts that showed signs of stress or fatigue. Skipping those overhauls was like playing Russian roulette with hundreds of passengers' lives. "How many aircraft are affected?" Dr. Mitchell asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to hear the answer. 18 out of the 23 long-haul aircraft we've reviewed, Kevin said. The entire Boeing 777 fleet is operating illegally, and most of the Airbus A330s have similar problems. We're talking about aircraft that are flying routes over the Atlantic Ocean with engines that should have been completely rebuilt months or even years ago. But the engine fraud was just the beginning of what Kevin's team had discovered. They'd also found evidence that Skybridge was using uncertified replacement parts, falsifying pilot training records, and operating aircraft with known structural defects that had been covered up rather than repaired. "Look at this inspection report from last year," Kevin said, showing Dr. Mitchell a document that had been heavily altered with correction fluid and handwritten changes. The original report shows significant fatigue cracking in the wing attachment points on aircraft N445SB. That's a critical structural issue that should have grounded the plane immediately. Dr. Mitchell examined the document, noting the obvious signs of alteration. But the final report shows no structural issues found. Right. Someone decided that fixing the wing cracks would cost too much money and take too long, so they just changed the inspection report instead, Kevin said. That plane has been flying passengers across the Atlantic for 8 months with wing cracks that could cause catastrophic structural failure. The technical violations Kevin had uncovered weren't just regulatory infractions. They were the kind of safety compromises that led to crashes. The fact that Skybridge had been operating this way for years without killing anyone was more luck than skill, and luck had a way of running out at the worst possible moments. "We need to contact the FAA immediately," Dr. Mitchell said, reaching for her phone. "These aircraft need to be grounded before someone dies." "Already done," Kevin said. "I called our liaison at the FAA Technical Center an hour ago. They're dispatching investigators and issuing emergency airworthiness directives for the entire Skybridge fleet. Every plane they operate will be on the ground by midnight tonight." Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. In situations like this, protecting passenger safety took precedence over everything else, including corporate relationships or financial considerations. If Skybridge Airways collapsed because their planes were grounded for safety violations, that was a problem they'd created for themselves. "What about criminal liability?" she asked. "Are we looking at individuals who knowingly signed off on unsafe aircraft?" Kevin pulled out one more folder, this one containing email correspondence between Skybridge executives and maintenance personnel. "Thomas Morrison, the VP of Operations, has been personally approving maintenance deferrals and overriding safety recommendations for at least 3 years. There's email traffic between him and the maintenance chief discussing how to hide problems from FAA inspectors during routine audits. The emails were damning in their casual discussion of potentially deadly safety compromises. In one exchange, Morrison had written, "The wing crack issue on 445SB is going to cost us $2 million to fix properly, and we'll lose the plane for 6 weeks. Can't we just monitor it and defer the repair until the next major maintenance cycle?" The maintenance chief had responded, "Monitoring fatigue cracks in primary wing structure is not recommended by Boeing or approved by FAA. This is a grounding item that requires immediate repair." Morrison's reply was brief and chilling. "Make it not a grounding item. We can't afford to lose the plane right now. That's conspiracy to commit fraud and reckless endangerment," Dr. Mitchell said after reading the exchange. "The Department of Justice is going to be very interested in Mr. Morrison and anyone else who signed off on these decisions." As the technical audit reached its conclusion, Kevin's team had documented safety violations that affected nearly every aircraft in Skybridge's fleet. They'd found evidence of maintenance fraud parts, counterfeiting inspection falsification, and executive cover-ups that represented one of the most comprehensive patterns of aviation safety violations in recent history. The discrimination that had triggered the audit was serious enough, but the safety violations they'd uncovered were potentially deadly. When federal investigators arrived the next morning, they wouldn't just be looking at civil rights violations. They'd be conducting a criminal investigation that could send multiple executives to prison for decades. Skybridge Airways had thought they could save money by cutting corners on safety and discrimination training, but their cost-cutting measures were about to cost them everything. The black SUVs started arriving at Skybridge Airways headquarters at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, pulling into the executive parking garage with the kind of coordinated precision that security cameras would later capture in footage that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world. Federal agents had been planning this operation since Dr. Mitchell's preliminary audit findings had been transmitted to Washington the night before, and what they'd read in those reports had prompted the kind of interagency response usually reserved for national security threats. Leading the operation was Special Agent Patricia Gomez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit, accompanied by investigators from the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General, the FAA's Enforcement Division, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. They moved through the building with the methodical efficiency of people who'd executed dozens of similar raids, securing floors and seizing documents while employees watched in shock from behind glass office doors. Richard Thornton was in the executive conference room on the 40th floor, frantically trying to coordinate damage control with his legal team when his assistant burst in without knocking. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are federal agents in the building. They have warrants." The room went completely silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of elevators moving between floors. Richard looked at the faces around the conference table. His chief financial officer, his head of operations, his general counsel, and 3 outside attorneys who'd been hired to handle the discrimination complaint, and saw his own panic reflected in their eyes. "What kind of warrants?" asked Jennifer Walsh, the lead outside counsel. Though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer would be worse than anyone had imagined. The assistant held up a document that was shaking in her hands. Criminal search warrants for documentation related to safety violations, discrimination complaints, and conspiracy to defraud federal regulators. They're seizing computers' files and they want to interview executives immediately. Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach as the full implications hit him. This wasn't just about Elijah Whitmore's discrimination complaint anymore. This was a federal criminal investigation that could destroy not just the company, but everyone in leadership positions who'd known about the problems and failed to fix them. How many agents, Jennifer asked, already reaching for her phone to call in additional legal support? "I don't know. A lot. They're on multiple floors, and they have a whole team just for computer forensics," the assistant said. "They told me to tell you that anyone who attempts to alter or destroy documentation will face additional federal charges for obstruction of justice." Through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard could see aircraft parked at Atlanta's airport, and for a moment he wondered how many of those planes belonged to Skybridge and whether they'd ever fly again. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was watching his company's planes from a conference room where he was about to be arrested by federal agents. The conference room door opened without a knock, and Special Agent Gomez walked in flanked by 2 other agents and followed by someone Richard recognized as an assistant United States attorney. They moved with the calm authority of people who held all the cards and knew exactly how this scenario was going to play out. "Richard Thornton," Agent Gomez said, though it wasn't a question, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal aviation safety regulations, wire fraud in connection with falsified maintenance records, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." The Miranda warning that followed seemed to stretch on forever, each phrase landing like individual blows, as Richard realized that his life as he'd known it was ending in real time. Around the conference table, other executives were receiving similar treatment as agents read them their rights and explained that they were being taken into federal custody pending arraignment. Thomas Morrison, the VP of Operations, whose emails had provided much of the evidence for the safety violations, was led away in handcuffs while his brother-in-law's discrimination complaints were being read into the record as evidence of a company-wide pattern of civil rights violations. The irony that protecting Veronica Hayes had ultimately led to everyone's downfall wasn't lost on the federal agents who'd read the case files. "This is ridiculous," Morrison said as the handcuffs clicked into place. "Every airline cuts maintenance costs. Every airline deals with difficult passengers. We didn't do anything that everyone else in the industry doesn't do." Mr. Morrison Agent Gomez replied calmly. "Every airline doesn't falsify federal inspection reports, operate aircraft with known structural defects, and maintain institutional policies that violate civil rights law. Those are the actions that brought federal law enforcement to your door." As the executives were led away, teams of forensic accountants and computer specialists were systematically seizing every electronic device and document that might contain evidence of the various federal crimes that had been uncovered by the AeroVault audit. Hard drives, email servers, backup systems, and paper files were all being cataloged and removed for analysis by investigators who specialized in unraveling complex corporate fraud schemes. The scene in the lobby was chaos as employees watched their leaders being arrested while federal agents carried boxes of evidence out to waiting vehicles. Some employees were crying, others were making frantic phone calls to family members or other potential employers, and a few were already updating their LinkedIn profiles to distance themselves from a company that had become radioactive overnight. By noon, the raid was complete, and Skybridge Airways headquarters was essentially a ghost building. The executives were in federal custody. The key evidence had been seized, and the remaining employees were left to wonder if they'd have jobs by the end of the week. The answer to that question would come sooner than they expected. The collapse of Skybridge Airways happened with a speed that shocked even veteran observers of the airline industry, where companies were used to operating on thin margins and facing sudden crises. By the time the evening news broadcasts began covering the federal raids and arrests, Skybridge's stock price had already fallen 73%, and trading had been halted by the Securities and Exchange Commission due to extreme volatility and irregular trading patterns. The immediate trigger for the financial collapse wasn't just the arrests, though those were certainly damaging enough. The real problem was the Federal Aviation Administration's Emergency Airworthiness Directive that grounded every aircraft in Skybridge's fleet pending comprehensive safety inspections. Airlines couldn't generate revenue without planes in the air, and Skybridge suddenly had 42 aircraft sitting on the ground burning money and parking fees while generating zero income. "The cash flow implications are catastrophic," said Michael Chen, the chief financial officer, during an emergency board meeting convened via phone while he waited for his attorney to arrange bail. "We have fixed costs of approximately $8 million per day, debt service, employee salaries, facility leases, insurance premiums, but zero revenue as long as the fleet is grounded." The board members who'd been hastily assembled for the call were grappling with a situation none of them had imagined when they'd accepted positions overseeing what had been a profitable mid-sized airline just 48 hours earlier. The liability exposure alone was staggering, with potential federal fines, civil lawsuits, and criminal penalties that could reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars. "What's our legal exposure looking like?" asked Margaret Foster, the board's lead independent director, though her voice suggested she wasn't optimistic about the answer. Severe replied Jennifer Walsh, the outside counsel, who was now coordinating legal strategy for multiple defendants facing federal charges. "The Justice Department is treating this as a pattern of institutional violations rather than isolated incidents. They're looking at RICO charges for conspiracy, which could allow them to seize corporate assets and impose criminal penalties on the company itself." The mention of RICO charges, typically reserved for organized crime cases, sent a chill through the board members who'd thought they were overseeing an airline, not a criminal enterprise. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act gave federal prosecutors powerful tools to dismantle organizations that engaged in ongoing patterns of illegal activity, and it carried penalties that could include complete forfeiture of business assets. "How did it get this bad?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer involved years of willful blindness by executives who'd prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. "The audit report from AeroVault shows that management knew about both the discrimination issues and the safety violations for years," Jennifer explained. There are emails, meeting minutes, and internal reports documenting executive awareness of problems and deliberate decisions to cover them up rather than fix them. The prosecutors aren't just alleging negligence, they're alleging intentional criminal conduct. While the board struggled with legal strategy, Skybridge's operational crisis was spiraling completely out of control. The airline had been forced to cancel every scheduled flight for the foreseeable future, leaving thousands of passengers stranded in airports around the world, while customer service representatives tried to explain why their airline had suddenly ceased to exist. The passenger lawsuits began filing within hours of the flight cancellations, with law firms specializing in airline litigation racing to courthouse steps to announce class action suits on behalf of travelers who'd been abandoned without warning. But the discrimination lawsuits were potentially even more damaging, as civil rights attorneys used Jessica Park's viral video and the federal arrest warrants to argue that Skybridge had maintained an institutional policy of racial discrimination. "We're looking at potentially hundreds of discrimination cases," Jennifer told the board. "Every passenger of color who's ever had a negative experience with Skybridge is going to come forward now, and the video evidence from the Whitmore incident provides a template for proving discrimination that's going to be very difficult to defend against." The financial markets had already rendered their verdict on Skybridge's future prospects. Credit rating agencies had downgraded the company's debt to junk status, making it impossible to borrow money at reasonable interest rates. Aircraft lessors were demanding immediate return of their planes and payment of outstanding lease obligations. Suppliers were requiring cash payment for fuel catering and ground services. Banks were freezing credit lines and demanding immediate repayment of outstanding loans. "We're facing a liquidity crisis that's probably insurmountable," Michael Chen reported from his attorney's office, where he was preparing for arraignment on federal fraud charges. "Even if the criminal charges were resolved tomorrow, which they won't be, we don't have the cash flow to restart operations or the creditworthiness to finance a restart." The board meeting lasted 4 hours and ended with a unanimous vote to authorize filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Though everyone involved understood that the company was more likely headed for complete liquidation than successful reorganization. Airlines that lost the trust of regulators, lessors, and passengers rarely recovered, and Skybridge had managed to lose all three simultaneously. By Friday evening, less than 72 hours after Elijah Whitmore had been denied his seat in first class, Skybridge Airways had filed for bankruptcy, its executives were in federal custody, and its 42 aircraft were being prepared for auction to pay creditors. The transformation of a discrimination complaint into a corporate death sentence would become a case study taught in business schools, law schools, and ethics programs for decades to come. But for the thousands of employees who lost their jobs and the passengers who were stranded around the world, it was simply proof that institutional arrogance and discrimination eventually carried a price that no company could afford to pay. Veronica Hayes discovered that being the face of viral discrimination carried consequences that extended far beyond losing a job, though losing the job was certainly where her problems began. She'd been terminated by Skybridge Airways within 6 hours of federal agents arriving at corporate headquarters, and the termination letter made it clear that she was being fired for cause, which meant no severance pay, no continuation of health insurance, and no positive references for future employment. The National Flight Attendants Union, which had represented her for 15 years, issued a statement distancing itself from her conduct and declining to provide legal representation for the discrimination charges. The message was clear. Veronica was on her own, facing federal civil rights violations, multiple civil lawsuits, and complete professional ruin while carrying legal bills that were already approaching 6 figures. "I can't get a job anywhere," she said to her attorney during one of their increasingly expensive meetings. "I've applied to Delta, United American, and every regional carrier. They won't even interview me. My name is on some kind of industry blacklist." The blacklist was real, though it wasn't officially maintained by any single organization. Word traveled fast in the airline industry, and Veronica's case had become such a high-profile example of discrimination that no human resources department wanted to risk hiring someone whose face was associated with federal civil rights violations. Even retail stores and restaurants were declining to hire her once they realized who she was. The financial consequences were mounting rapidly. Veronica's mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks, and she didn't have the money to make it. Her car had already been repossessed after she missed 3 payments. The legal fees for defending against federal charges were consuming what remained of her savings, and her attorney had made it clear that she'd need to find additional funding if she wanted adequate representation. But the social consequences were almost worse than the financial ones. Veronica's neighbors had seen the viral video and the news coverage, and their children were no longer allowed to play with her children. Parents at her son's school avoided her during pickup and drop-off. The grocery store clerks who'd known her for years now treated her with cold politeness that felt like walking through a minefield. "Mom, why did that lady at the store look at you funny?" her 8-year-old daughter asked after a particularly uncomfortable shopping trip where other customers had recognized Veronica and begun whispering. The question broke something inside Veronica that had been holding together through sheer force of will. How could she explain to her children that their mother had become famous for being cruel to a stranger based on the color of his skin? How could she make them understand that her actions had consequences that would follow their family for years? Mr. Wellington's fall from grace was equally swift and arguably more devastating because he'd had further to fall. The investment firm where he'd worked for 23 years had terminated him within 48 hours of the video going viral, citing a morality clause in his employment contract that prohibited conduct that reflected poorly on the company's reputation. The partners met yesterday and voted unanimously to end your employment immediately, his supervisor explained during what was euphemistically called an exit interview. "We have clients who are threatening to pull their portfolios if we continue to employ someone who made racist statements that have been viewed by millions of people." Wellington's protests that his comments had been taken out of context and blown out of proportion fell on deaf ears. In the current social media environment, context mattered less than impact, and the impact of his casually racist commentary about people trying to scam their way into upgrades they can't afford had been immediate and devastating. The financial consequences for Wellington were more severe than for Veronica because he'd had more to lose. His 7-figure annual compensation was gone along with the stock options and bonuses that had been building toward a comfortable retirement. The Manhattan apartment he'd owned for 15 years would have to be sold to pay legal fees and living expenses. The country club membership, the vacation home in the Hamptons, and the lifestyle that had defined his identity for decades were all disappearing with shocking speed. Captain James Crawford's career destruction was perhaps the most professionally devastating because airline pilots invested decades building the experience and credentials necessary to captain international flights. His pilot's license had been suspended pending investigation of the federal charges, and even if he eventually avoided criminal conviction, the suspension would make him unemployable in commercial aviation. 28 years of flying, he said to his attorney during a strategy session that felt more like grief counseling. "I started as a flight instructor making $30,000 a year and worked my way up to captain on international routes. All of that is gone because I trusted a flight attendant's judgment instead of doing my own investigation." Crawford's case was complicated by the fact that he'd been following what he thought were proper crew resource management protocols when he supported Veronica's decision to remove a passenger. Pilots were trained to trust their cabin crew's assessment of passenger behavior, especially when crew members expressed safety concerns. The problem was that Veronica's concerns hadn't been based on safety. They'd been based on racial bias that Crawford had failed to recognize. "The FAA is reviewing your pilot certification under their fitness for duty standards," his attorney explained. "Even if the criminal charges are resolved favorably, they may determine that your judgment was sufficiently impaired to warrant permanent revocation of your license." The personal costs extended beyond the primary actors to include family members who found themselves dealing with consequences they'd never anticipated. Veronica's husband, who worked in construction, was let go from a project after other workers recognized his wife from the news coverage. Wellington's adult children faced uncomfortable questions at their own jobs and social events. Crawford's wife, a teacher, dealt with students and parents who connected her to the viral video through her married name. The viral nature of the incident meant that the consequences weren't limited to immediate professional repercussions. Social media had created a permanent record of their involvement that would follow them indefinitely, making it difficult to move to new communities or start fresh careers without their past catching up with them. For people who'd thought of themselves as respectable members of society, the transformation into public symbols of discrimination and corporate corruption was psychologically devastating. They'd gone from anonymity to infamy overnight, and the internet's long memory meant there was no clear path back to the normal lives they'd taken for granted. The personal reckonings were still continuing as the broader corporate investigation moved toward criminal trials that would determine whether discrimination and safety violations carried consequences beyond just losing jobs and reputations. The bankruptcy auction for Skybridge Airways took place in a Delaware courtroom on a rainy Thursday morning, 6 months after Elijah Whitmore had been denied his seat in first class, and the proceedings had attracted attention from aviation industry observers around the world who wanted to see how one of the most spectacular corporate collapses in airline history would finally end. Elijah sat in the back row of the courtroom gallery next to William Blackwood, watching as various airlines, investment firms, and asset management companies bid on the pieces of what had once been a $3 billion enterprise. The atmosphere was businesslike but somber, with the kind of respectful quiet that attended the dismantling of someone's life's work, even when that life's work had been built on discrimination and safety violations. "It's like watching vultures pick over a carcass," William said quietly, nodding toward the crowd of potential buyers who were examining financial documents and asset inventories that detailed everything from aircraft lease agreements to coffee machines in corporate break rooms. "Sometimes vultures perform a necessary function," Elijah replied, watching as the auctioneer called for bids on Skybridge's route authorities and airport gate leases. "They clean up what's dead so something healthier can grow in its place." The bankruptcy had proceeded exactly as everyone had predicted, with the company's assets being sold to pay creditors, while the executives faced federal criminal trials that were expected to result in significant prison sentences. The discrimination and safety violations had made Skybridge toxic to potential investors, so liquidation had been the only viable option. But what most observers didn't know was that AeroVault International had been quietly positioning itself to acquire the most valuable pieces of Skybridge's operations, including the aircraft they already owned through lease agreements, the maintenance facilities where their planes were serviced, and the airport slots that would allow them to operate their own airline. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, consists of the entire long-haul route network, including London Heathrow slots, Tokyo Narita authorities, and European Union operating certificates. Bidding will begin at $200 million. William raised his paddle with the casual confidence of someone who'd already decided he was willing to pay whatever it took to acquire the assets he wanted. The bidding was brief and anticlimactic, with most potential competitors dropping out once they realized AeroVault was serious about owning the entire package. "Sold to AeroVault International for $420 million, the auctioneer said, bringing his gavel down with the finality of corporate death and rebirth, combined into a single moment. 2 hours later, William and Elijah were sitting in the conference room of a downtown Atlanta law firm, signing the paperwork that would transform AeroVault from an aircraft leasing company into a full-service airline. The lawyers had been working for months to structure the acquisition in a way that would allow them to restart operations while completely distancing the new company from Skybridge's toxic legacy. "We'll need a new name," William said, reviewing the corporate formation documents that would establish their airline subsidiary. "Something that suggests reliability, safety, and inclusion without carrying any baggage from the old company." Unity Airways. Elijah suggested without hesitation. Unity suggests that we bring people together rather than dividing them. It suggests that flying should be about shared experiences rather than segregated ones. William nodded approvingly. Unity Airways it is. And Elijah, I want you to leave the legal department and become our Chief Customer Experience Officer. I want you to build an airline culture that makes what happened to you impossible. The job offer wasn't entirely surprising. William had been hinting for months that he wanted Elijah to take a more operational role in the new airline, but accepting it would mean leaving behind 15 years of legal practice to become something he'd never been before, an airline executive responsible for ensuring that every passenger was treated with dignity and respect. What would that actually involve? Elijah asked, though he was already leaning toward accepting the challenge. Everything that touches passenger experience, William said. Hiring practices, training programs, service standards, complaint, resolution procedures, diversity initiatives. I want you to create an airline where discrimination isn't just prohibited, it's unthinkable. Elijah thought about Veronica Hayes and her 31 discrimination complaints that had been covered up rather than addressed. He thought about the passengers who'd endured humiliation and harassment because an airline had decided that discrimination was acceptable as long as it didn't generate too much negative publicity. He thought about his daughter Zoe and the world he wanted her to inherit. I'll take it, he said, extending his hand to shake on an agreement that would transform him from discrimination victim to the architect of systemic change in the airline industry. The paperwork for launching Unity Airways took 3 more months to complete, involving regulatory approval staff, hiring training program development, and the kind of detailed operational planning that went into creating an airline from scratch. But when Unity Airways finally began operations, it represented everything that Skybridge Airways had failed to be: an airline built on principles of inclusion, safety, and respect for every passenger, regardless of their background or appearance. The first flights were deliberately symbolic, with diverse crews serving passengers on routes that had once been operated by Skybridge under very different principles. Elijah personally flew on several of the inaugural flights, not in first class this time, but moving throughout the cabin to talk with passengers and crew members about their experiences. It feels different. One passenger told him during a flight from Chicago to London, I can't put my finger on exactly what it is, but the whole atmosphere feels more welcoming. What felt different was the absence of the institutional bias that had infected Skybridge's culture for years. Unity Airways had been built from the ground up, with inclusion as a core value, and every policy procedure and training program reflected that commitment. 1 year after the incident that destroyed Skybridge Airways and launched Unity Airways, Elijah Whitmore boarded Flight U, A847 from Chicago to London. The same route, same departure time, and same aircraft type that had been the scene of his discrimination and humiliation 12 months earlier. But everything else about the experience was fundamentally different. The gate area was buzzing with the kind of positive energy that came from passengers who felt welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Elijah watched families with children getting assistance from ground crew members who seemed genuinely happy to help, rather than annoyed by the inconvenience. He observed business travelers of all backgrounds moving through the boarding process with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested the system had been designed for inclusion rather than exclusion. Mr. Whitmore called a voice from the gate counter, and Elijah turned to see Maria Santos, Unity Airways' head flight attendant for international routes. She was a 15-year veteran of the industry who'd been personally recruited by Elijah after her outstanding record of customer service and her reputation for treating every passenger with equal respect. Maria, Elijah said, accepting the boarding pass she handed him. "How's the crew feeling about today's flight?" "Excited," she said with the kind of genuine smile that passengers noticed and remembered. "We've got a full cabin with passengers from 23 different countries, and the crew is looking forward to making sure everyone has a great experience. Oh, and we have the Whitmore family traveling in first class today. No relation to you, I assume, and they specifically requested to meet you during the flight. Elijah laughed at the coincidence. I'd be happy to meet them. Are they familiar with Unity Airways' history? Very familiar, Maria said. Mr. Whitmore, the passenger, not you, said he chose Unity Airways specifically because of our commitment to treating every passenger with dignity. He said he wanted his children to fly on an airline where discrimination wasn't tolerated. The boarding process itself was a masterclass in operational efficiency combined with human warmth. Instead of the adversarial relationship between crew and passengers that had characterized many airlines, Unity Airways had created a culture where helping passengers was genuinely viewed as the most important part of everyone's job. Elijah's seat, 2A, the same seat he'd been denied a year earlier, was now a symbol of transformation rather than humiliation. As he settled in, he noticed that the first-class cabin was more diverse than any he'd seen on a major airline, with passengers representing a broad spectrum of ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds that suggested Unity Airways was actually succeeding in creating an inclusive travel experience. Welcome aboard. Mr. Whitmore, said David Chen, the senior purser who'd been personally trained by Elijah on Unity Airways customer service standards. The captain asked me to let you know that we're expecting smooth air all the way to London, and the entire crew is honored to have you flying with us today. The contrast with his experience a year earlier was almost overwhelming. Instead of suspicious questioning and implicit accusations of fraud, he was being treated with the kind of respect that every passenger deserved. Instead of being made to feel like an intruder in first class, he was being welcomed as a valued customer, whose presence enhanced rather than diminished other passengers' experiences. As the Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Elijah pulled out his phone and sent a text message to his daughter. Flight is perfect, sweetheart. Can't wait to see you in London for your piano recital. Dad. This time he wasn't missing the recital for corporate negotiations or crisis management. This time he was traveling to London specifically to watch Zoe perform, because building an inclusive airline had taught him that success meant nothing if it came at the expense of the relationships that actually mattered. The takeoff was smooth and powerful, the Rolls-Royce engines that Aerovault owned, climbing them efficiently toward cruising altitude, while Elijah reflected on how much had changed since the last time he'd attempted this journey. The aircraft was the same model, the route was identical, and even some of the crew members were former Skybridge employees who'd been rehired after comprehensive training in Unity Airways inclusion standards. But the culture was completely different. Instead of an environment where discrimination was tolerated as long as it didn't generate complaints, Unity Airways had created a workplace where inclusion was celebrated as essential to operational excellence. Instead of covering up problems, they proactively addressed issues and used them as opportunities to improve their service standards. "How does it feel?" asked the passenger in seat 3A who'd introduced himself as Robert Kim, a business consultant who'd chosen Unity Airways after researching their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Different, Elijah said, looking around the cabin at passengers who represented the kind of diversity that made America strong rather than threatening. It feels like flying should feel. Like we're all just people trying to get somewhere together. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin service began, Elijah realized that his year of work building Unity Airways had accomplished something more important than just creating a successful airline. He'd proven that discrimination wasn't an inevitable part of business culture, that inclusion was compatible with operational efficiency, and that treating people with dignity was not just the right thing to do, but also the profitable thing to do. The flight to London would be unremarkable in the best possible way. Smooth, comfortable, and dignified for every passenger regardless of their seat assignment or their appearance. It was exactly what Elijah had envisioned when he'd accepted Williams' offer to build an airline where his own experience of discrimination would be impossible to replicate. 2 years after a flight attendant's bias destroyed a billion-dollar airline and created a new standard for inclusion in aviation, Elijah Whitmore stood at the podium of Harvard Law School's annual Civil Rights Symposium, looking out at an audience of students, professors, and practitioners who'd gathered to hear him speak about the intersection of corporate accountability and social justice. "The question I'm asked most frequently," Elijah said, "is whether I ever regret making that phone call from the jet bridge in Chicago. People want to know if I feel guilty about the thousands of jobs that were lost when Skybridge Airways collapsed, or whether I think the punishment exceeded the crime of one flight attendant's discriminatory behavior." The audience was completely silent, waiting for his answer to a question that had been debated in business schools, law schools, and ethics programs since the Skybridge case had become a landmark study in corporate responsibility. "The answer is simple," Elijah continued. "I didn't destroy Skybridge Airways. I simply refused to accept discrimination quietly, and that refusal revealed problems that the company had been hiding for years. If a single phone call could bring down an entire airline, the airline was already doomed by its own institutional failures. Unity Airways had exceeded every performance metric in its first 2 years of operation, becoming the highest-rated carrier for customer satisfaction while maintaining industry-leading profitability. The company's success had proven that inclusion wasn't just morally necessary. It was economically advantageous, attracting customers who wanted to support businesses that reflected their values. The ripple effects had extended far beyond Unity Airways. The Skybridge scandal had prompted industry-wide reviews of discrimination policies, with major airlines implementing new training programs, complaint procedures, and accountability measures designed to prevent similar incidents. The Department of Transportation had established new reporting requirements for discrimination complaints, and several airlines had hired chief diversity officers with authority to investigate and address bias in their operations. "My daughter Zoe is now 10 years old," Elijah said, wrapping up his speech, "and she's growing up in a world where the kind of discrimination I experienced is less likely to be tolerated and more likely to have consequences. That's not because people are inherently better than they were 2 years ago, but because institutions have learned that discrimination is expensive, dangerous, and ultimately unsustainable in a diverse democracy." After the speech, as Elijah was walking across Harvard Yard toward his car, his phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos. "UA 847 just touched down in London. Full flight, happy passengers, no incidents." The empty seat. A memorial plaque got lots of attention. Passengers were asking about the story. "Thought you'd want to know. People are still learning from what happened." The memorial plaque had been Elijah's idea, a small brass marker installed in every Unity Airways first-class cabin that read, "This seat is dedicated to every passenger who has faced discrimination while traveling. Their dignity matters. Their stories matter. Their experiences make us better." It served as both a reminder of the company's founding principles and a conversation starter that kept the lessons of the Skybridge incident alive for new generations of travelers. As Elijah drove through Cambridge toward the airport for his own flight back to Chicago, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since that Tuesday morning when a flight attendant's bias had transformed him from a passenger into a symbol of corporate accountability. He'd traded the predictability of legal practice for the daily challenges of running an airline. But the work felt more meaningful because it directly affected thousands of people who deserved to be treated with dignity when they traveled. The legacy of that 11-minute confrontation on Flight 847 would continue long after the viral video was forgotten and the federal prosecutions were complete, because it had proven that individual courage could create institutional change when combined with the resources and determination to see justice through to its conclusion. Elijah Whitmore had refused to accept discrimination quietly, and in doing so, he'd made the sky a more welcoming place for everyone who followed in his footsteps. Unity Airways continues to operate as one of America's most successful and inclusive airlines, serving as proof that treating people with dignity isn't just the right thing to do. it's also the profitable thing to do. The Skybridge Airways case remains a landmark study in business schools and law schools, demonstrating how quickly institutional discrimination can destroy even the largest corporations when it's finally exposed to public scrutiny and legal accountability. Elijah Whitmore's phone call didn't just ground one flight. It changed an entire industry.